Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to everyone joining us around the world today for the 8th episode of RF Breakthrough, Raising Energy Ambitions, the Modern Energy Minimum. My name is Ashvin, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation's Power and Climate Initiative, and it's great to have you joining us today. Now, we all know that access to reliable power equals access to opportunity, upward mobility, and wealth creation, and much more. And we know that no country in human history has been able to deliver widespread economic opportunity to its people without significant electricity consumption. It is fundamental to modern living and economic prosperity. The COVID crisis has further exposed the stark inequalities that exist between countries and communities that do not rather have access to modern and reliable electricity with those that do. And indeed, as we look with hope to the COVID-19 vaccine distribution, rollout, and an economic recovery, the urgency of providing modern energy for everyone has never been greater. Will the rebound drive new inequalities, or can it actually be a period in which we reset underlying conditions and chart a better course? The UN's SDG Goal 7 calls for access to affordable and reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. Yet the primary indicator for residential electrification today is a threshold of just 100 kilowatt hours per capita per year, a bare bones level of consumption that cannot raise incomes or sustain economic growth. Global efforts to fight energy poverty need to raise their longer-term ambitions if we're serious about driving more equitable and inclusive economic development and lifting people out of poverty for good. Today, we'll be talking about the Energy for Growth Hub's latest work that aims to reflect the full ambition of SDG 7, proposing a new modern energy minimum metric of 1,000 kilowatt hours. This raises the bar on global targets for ending energy poverty, aiming to better align with the way that energy drives living standards, livelihoods, and the expansion of industry, commerce, and agriculture at a village level, district, subnational, and national levels. Before we jump into the panel discussion, we're going to show you a short video from the Energy for Growth Hub that provides an overview of what exactly the modern energy minimum is and why we think it should be a North Star on which we base our collective efforts to end energy poverty in the long term. After the video, our moderator and Energy for Growth Hub's Policy Director, Katie Auth, will begin our discussion. And finally, please do share your thoughts about this event and the topics on our social media channels using the hashtag RF Breakthrough. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Abundant, reliable energy drives prosperity. No country in history has become prosperous without it. But billions of people live without that kind of energy today, which means they're at risk of being left behind in the global economy. These billions of people need more than just the energy for a few light bulbs at home or to charge a mobile phone. They need to move further up the energy ladder with energy that can power schools, hospitals, factories, data centers, and everything else in a modern economy. Energy that literally powers jobs, brings new ideas to life, and builds better lives. That's why the current bar for energy access is too low. The threshold for energy access is just 100 kilowatt hours per person per year and only at home. An important first step, but it's time to raise our ambitions. The modern energy minimum is that next step. It is a new metric that tracks people using at least 1,000 kilowatt hours. It's a target that covers energy used at home and across the wider economy, enough to propel billions within reach of the middle class. When we aim for the next step on the energy ladder, we can win the fight against poverty. Learn more about the modern energy minimum and help us power economic prosperity for everyone.
Great, fantastic. Now we're going to move into a panel discussion. We have a really great group of experts here to talk more about the modern energy minimum and dive into some of the details. But first, I want to start by thanking Ashvin, Suman, Raj, and the entire Rockefeller team for supporting all of this work and for hosting us on this platform today. My name is Katie Auth. I am the Policy Director for the Energy for Growth Hub. I joined the Hub just recently from USAID, where I helped lead the US government's Power Africa initiative, which aimed at tackling energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. And the Modern Energy Minimum project actually got started before I joined the Hub. But while I was at Power Africa, I saw firsthand the amazing things that can happen when the international community rallies around a common goal for tackling energy poverty. And while providing that first tier of basic electricity access is critical, there is so much more that we need to do to actually end energy poverty. So I'm beyond thrilled to now be associated with the Hub and with this project and this effort to raise our collective ambitions. Let me introduce our amazing panelists. First is Ashvin Dayal. Ashvin is the Senior Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation's Power Initiative, where he drives the foundation's global investments to end energy poverty. He previously ran the foundation's regional office in Bangkok. And before joining Rockefeller, he held a range of senior leadership roles with Oxfam in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Welcome, Ashvin. Next, we have Todd Moss. Todd is the founder and executive director of the Energy for Growth Hub. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute, and the Colorado School of Mines Payne Institute. Previously, Todd served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, as Chief Operating Officer at CGD, and worked at the World Bank. And Todd was a lead author of the Modern Energy Minimum report. Next, we have Rose Mutiso. Rose is the Energy for Growth Hub's research director, where, among many other things, she helped develop the Modern Energy Minimum and served as a co-author of the report. She's also the co-founder and the CEO of the Mutiso Institute, which supports the next generation of female scholars and thought leaders in East Africa. Previously, Rose was a senior fellow in the Office of International Climate and Clean Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, and before that, an Innovation and Energy Policy Fellow in the Office of U.S. Senator Chris Coons. And finally, we have Lauren Culver. She is an energy specialist at the World Bank, and she also served as a co-author of the Modern Energy Minimum report. Between 2012 and 2014, she served as an advisor with the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. She was also a presidential management fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy. And before we get into the questions, I just want to quickly clarify that Lauren is here today joining us in her private capacity, so she will not be representing the World Bank. I want to dive into the panel, but first I want to remind everyone tuning in, regardless of what platform that you're on, to use the chat function to enter any questions that you have, and we will do our best to get to several of those a little later on in the discussion. So feel free to participate and shoot us any thoughts that you might have. I want to start by asking Todd a question. So Todd, we just saw that really great video which lays out the basic premise of the Modern Energy Minimum. But if you could give us a bit more big context, what's the real point of the Modern Energy Minimum and where does the idea come from?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. The point is that everyone needs a lot more energy than the current target that we've got. And we're really at a risk, of creating, and I don't think it's too strong a word, energy apartheid, if we don't raise the bar. The idea for the Modern Energy Minimum really started with a beautiful little 5-page paper from Morgan Bazilian and Roger Pilkey called "Making Energy Access Meaningful," and we're very grateful Morgan joined us on this effort to create the Modern Energy Minimum. Along with a truly wonderful cast of characters, including some of the world's best energy scholars like B.J. Modi and Michael Weber, rising stars in academia like Mira Mahadevan and Jay Taneja. We've got some real scholar practitioners like Lauren and Rose with us today, and Musa Blimpo, who is the author of the brand new signature book from the World Bank on electrification in Africa. So it's really been a collective effort of 14 of us from around the world, and I really couldn't be happier about that. really the starting point for the modern energy minimum is that the electricity and income relationship is very, very tight. Can we just stick up figure 1, please? Great. So you can see this is data. The little gray circles are data for all countries for all years since 1980, and the relationship is very, very tight. For those of you who care about the nerdy details, that's in the report, but the correlation here is 0.77, and really we highlighted Vietnam and Korea as 2 perfect examples that illustrate the energy ladder and the relationship to income. Now, all of us on the team have been thinking for a while about, well, what is that next step? And the corollary I like to think about is income poverty. So with income poverty, we have $1.90 a day, and everyone sees ending this extreme poverty as the very first step toward getting everyone into the middle class. So we wanted to ask, well, what's the electricity equivalent? If basic access, the 100 kilowatt hours, is that first step, what's the next step toward the energy middle class? And that's really the modern energy minimum. And that's how we arrived at 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. So if we can just jump to the next figure. So here, this is that same graph with the same data with different lines. You can see the modern energy minimum is correlated with about $2,500 per year, just under $7 a day, and that is the midpoint of the World Bank's lower middle income group. So that's where the second step has been set. So what we really wanted to achieve is first to raise the bar to aim higher, and secondly, we wanted to have a metric that went beyond household electricity. Everyone should have household electricity. It's an absolute must that we provide universal basic access to everyone as soon as possible. But energy for job creation and economic growth is mostly used outside the home. It's used in industry and commerce, and people need both. And we thought that the metric should also reflect both.
Great, thank you, Todd. Ashvin, I want to turn to you. So the Rockefeller Foundation has a large focus on distributed energy solutions, largely for underserved and low-income populations. But the modern energy minimum aims at a slightly different population and has a different set of constraints and goals. How do you see these 2 efforts fitting together, and why do you think that the modern energy minimum is a critical part of the foundation's portfolio?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a fair question in terms of where our historical focus has been. As a foundation, as you mentioned, we've been doing over the last decade a lot of work on understanding how you can unleash and really drive forward the full potential of the newer technologies we've seen emerging, mini grids, distributed renewable electrification solutions. But we've really had a strong focus on, within that, on powering productive use activities. So right from the outset, although you say that we're working at a different, with focusing on different communities, you know, these projects that we've been involved in are now reaching close to 500,000 people, and we've seen the dramatic impacts that even small amounts of productive use energy can have on people's lives and on their livelihoods. So yes, the context is different. We're looking at rural, poor. You know, you're often dealing with households and communities where the average consumption level is, you know, not even at 100, it's below 50, in some cases below 25 being the norm. So we are thinking about this as part of a journey. We initially think that, you know, if you take an intermediate rural energy minimum at around 300 or 400, that would actually be a first step towards getting on a much more inclusive footing when it comes to energy equality. You know, Todd and I have been talking about this idea of, you know, what would it look like to take a sort of headcount approach to energy consumption or electricity consumption, going beyond averages and thinking about even applying some version of the concept of a sort of a Gini coefficient for electricity consumption to avoid that situation that Todd talks about the idea of electricity divide or apartheid emerging in the world. So ultimately for us, the idea of a modern energy minimum at 1,000 kilowatt hours is entirely consistent. Yes, it will take time, but it's a really, really important North Star. And our view is that we're in a unique technological era, and we have to have a dedicated commitment to driving increased electricity consumption for not just the 800 million who are unelectrified, for 2.5, 3 billion energy poor people. And we have to do this in a manner that's equitable. We have to do it in a manner that is climate friendly. And so when we call for 1,000 kilowatt hour consumption level for every individual, it comes with a deep sense of responsibility as well to be talking about how we get there in a manner that's urgent, that's cost effective, and that's climate smart. So, we're really focused on galvanizing a larger global effort to accelerate investments in green and inclusive solutions, including DRE, that can be more quickly and cost effectively deployed. And to that end, the modern energy minimum is a really powerful message, I think, for all of us to rally around as we shape programs and partnerships, speaking more from a practitioner's perspective.
Great, that's fantastic. Rose, so you come at this from a really interesting perspective because you've been involved both on the US policy side when you were at Department of Energy and with Senator Coons, and you also have been working to fight energy poverty on the Kenyan side. What do those two perspectives mean to you in this context, and why do you think the modern energy minimum is so critical?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so, it's really interesting because definitely over the past several years, there's been a growing awareness among policymakers, development partners, both globally and in country, that, there's like a link between energy and growth. Like people kind of get it, and we see this when development leaders claim that, energy is a so-called golden thread that links all development goals, or when politicians are promising their constituents in places like Kenya, elsewhere, that, okay, we're going to bring development, we're bringing power to your villages. And so there's just kind of been this background drumbeat that these two things are linked, and people talk a lot about it. But I think over the years, we haven't really seen this awareness translate to the kinds of actions that truly unlock the potential of power to drive economic growth and job creation. And so people get it on one level, but we're not following through on the logic of how energy and growth interconnect. And I think one reason that at the Hub we often talk about is that, our goals and metrics somehow are misdirecting us. And in particular, we're bound by this SDG 7 framework, which has been really successful in drawing attention to energy poverty. It's been a massive coup to get energy on the development agenda. But then there's still all of these gaps and limitations. For example, this kind of framing has led us to focus on residential access rather than maybe targeting priority sectors linked to growth. We've also been focused on counting binary connections rather than fleshing out more robust metrics such as consumption levels, pricing, reliability. And so I think MEM helps correct this by giving us, as Ashvin said, a simple first order kind of approximation, like a North Star of kind of what level of consumption in which sectors are indicative of productive links between energy and development. And so this is a simple diagnostic tool that gives us a nice high level target, this North Star, that we can work towards and kind of provides a basis for constructive problem solving when it comes to energy poverty. And so what I've seen both working in the US and internationally and then working on the continent is, we get it, but we're not following through. We don't get it. Like, our awareness is partial, our understanding of the problem. And for many reasons, including political reasons, we're not able to follow through on the logic of how energy unlocks growth. And I think that MEM is kind of this kind of first order correction on, okay, this is a constructive way to think about the problem. Okay, how can we then work towards this high level goal? How can it be, a motivating target?
Great. And you've made a couple really powerful public appeals to close that gap, which we're going to talk about a little later on. So Lauren, I want to turn to you. You've actually been studying energy metrics and targets for quite some time in a couple different contexts. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the lessons you learned about the importance of this type of metric, either while you were at State Department or during your research at Stanford.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to the Rockefeller Foundation and the Energy for Growth Hub for inviting me back into this exciting world of energy metrics. And as was said before, although I've done a lot of work in this in the past, it's not my role at the World Bank now, and nor has it been. And so I'm speaking today in a private capacity. I think, the most important lesson that I've learned about energy metrics, energy poverty metrics specifically, is that you really need to keep the context of the metric in mind. And here we're talking really about the international development community context. So why is it that we have energy poverty metrics? Why is it that we have metrics in the international development world? And really, I would suggest there's three reasons. One is to be able to compare across countries. That's obviously very useful for the international development community to see the scale of the problem and to see what countries may be lagging behind and need more support. It's also useful for the countries themselves to be able to advocate that they do need more resources, whether that's financing or talent. It really helps them make the case both nationally and internationally that they need additional support for that issue. We also use these international metrics to look at the same country over time. And that's really important both for the development community and for the countries themselves to be able to track their progress. Are they moving in the right direction? Is it going at the speed that they want? Should resources be reallocated? The third reason that I think these international development community metrics are so important is that it communicates our values as an international development community. You've heard a lot already from the other panelists about the importance of energy in the economy for growth, for equality, for inclusion, and I think that there's a lot of the SDGs get a lot of flack for just the sheer number of them and the number of sub metrics and sub targets. But in reality, that's what those are doing, are communicating what's important to the international community, what's important for development, and to the beneficiaries of development support. So I think this MEM really helps bring up the question of how should we be considering how do we value energy outside of a minimum household level for basic energy services.
Great, thanks, Lauren. I think it's often underappreciated how much metrics really drive what we do and what we achieve. So Rose, going back to your call to kind of close the gap between ambition and policy, you have a hugely popular TED Talk available now, actually 2 TED Talks, that make a really strong case for why, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a need for much, much more energy. If you could, can you give us a very brief overview of what your argument there is and how the modern energy minimum kind of fits into that?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. The whole popular TED Talk thing is kind of an idea I'm still getting used to. It has been a lot of fun, and I think what is so important about having these 2 TED Talks is it really helped me working together with colleagues at the Hub, like Todd and others, to kind of really synthesize our thinking about how the core Energy for Growth message, which is that we need abundant, affordable, and reliable energy in Africa to power this high energy future in which Africans can enjoy modern living standards, jobs, dignity, and growing economies. And how can we communicate that in a compelling way that is that kind of provides a sense of a path forward and a sense of solutions-based conversation, as opposed to just being like, this is a problem. And so I think in the first TED Talk was really to kind of set the scene of this Energy for Growth message. And in particular, I was reacting to these kind of three main misconceptions about energy poverty in Africa that we felt at the Hub prevents all of the different actors in the space from achieving the goal of this high energy future. And so, the first things first was this idea of misdiagnosing the problem, not understanding what energy is really or how deep it goes, and having kind of solving a partial problem as opposed to the whole problem. And then the second kind of misconception we're reacting to was this idea of distractions, quick fixes, and kind of what are the different kind of solutions as to energy poverty and which ones address which problems. And so, for example, off-grid solar, really important, very small scale microsystems, a big part of the energy poverty solution set, but which part of the problem do they solve versus which part do they not solve? And same for large scale power, same for renewable versus non-renewable, just kind of really trying to look at the problem holistically as opposed to being drawn to, as we were seeing, just kind of quick, simplistic fixes. And then the third thing we're reacting to in that first TED Talk was this idea of how the climate conversation, which obviously is really important, it's the challenge of our age, but how we were seeing it being weaponized in a way that was kind of misdirecting kind of action when it comes to energy and in Africa and climate change. So in the second talk, I was really delving into that third piece on climate change, which is trying to get it clear, because a lot of people feel like growth and energy and development in Africa are kind of in opposition to climate change. And so this was, I think this we felt was like a growing stumbling block that we wanted to clarify. And here we're really focusing on this idea that prioritizing mitigation doesn't make sense in Africa. This is historically has been and will be for a long time a very minor player when it comes to emissions on the global stage, and that the real climate crisis is not how to avoid emissions, but how can we adapt to the real threat of climate change, which African countries are already grappling with, and that this adaptation play is very energy focused because you require energy to adapt. You need more energy than less. And then the third point we're making was just really wanting to underline and underscore this undercurrent of climate colonialism, or just needing to advocate for climate justice and exposing hypocrisy that we notice when people talk about climate change and development in Africa. There's a sense of them and us, and this is what they deserve versus us. And so taking these two talks together, it was just all about, the core message was we need to raise ambition for energy in Africa. We need to not get distracted by misdiagnosing the problem, mischaracterizing it, by attributing kind of roadblocks like climate in ways that need not be, or by getting distracted by kind of sexy leapfrogging quick fixes that prevent us from seeing the whole problem. And so I think that the MEM gives us a good starting point in this to kind of, once we've kind of, as the TED Talks try to do, once we've kind of set up the problem and said, this is a problem, this is not the problem, these are the things that are distracting, these are the things that we need to focus on. The MEM gives us a good starting point by kind of setting a new standard that kind of points us in the direction of the kinds of energy systems that can deliver growth and climate resilience in Africa. And we hope that can kind of transcend the myths, the distractions, and just give us something constructive to focus on that bypasses all of the noise, essentially.
Thanks, Rose. And if anyone hasn't checked out her 2 TED Talks, I highly encourage you to do so. They're awesome. We do have a couple additional questions for the group, but before we do that, I do just want to remind anyone who's tuning in, please do submit questions if you have them. It's amazing to see that we currently have viewers logged in from the US, from India, Armenia, Uganda, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, and elsewhere. So please do share your perspectives, and we'd love to answer some of your questions if we can. Ashvin, I want to turn to you. You've talked about this a little bit in your previous answer, the link between energy access and really driving meaningful productive use and benefits for livelihoods. And you've spent much of your career focused on ending not just energy poverty, but poverty in many different forms. Can you talk a little bit more about the role that you see the modern energy minimum playing in the drive for inclusive economic activity and growth?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. My focus professionally for more than 30 years has been on really looking at drivers of economic development and poverty reduction. And I think what is interesting is the way the debate around electrification has evolved. For a long time, as I was a young development professional, focused really on the social and economic development, electrification was kind of an outcome of development rather than a driver of development. But I think as we've started to look at the reality of how economies work in the 21st century, the idea of an electrification divide, the idea that if you want to be connected and able to participate in the modern economy, when you think about the way value chains are structured even in the agricultural sector, access to reliable, productive use electrification was starting to become increasingly recognized as a critical lever for achieving economic change, achieving poverty reduction. And that's, I think, why we see it reflected in the SDGs as we did. It's why, if you take something like the multidimensional index on poverty, one of the 10 deprivations in that index is electrification. And it's interesting, I was talking with the team there at OPHI recently, who, for I think their 2019 data shows that actually non-electrification is the most accurate predictor of extreme poverty. So the correlations have become really strong. But at a practical level too, it's a sector that actually, given the technological changes it's going through, has an enormous potential to drive localized economic development. And we are thinking a lot about not just access to electrification at a national level, but in every village, in every district, in every community. How do you get to this idea of distributed economic development? How do you create jobs locally? All of the things that we need to see happening as a result of the economic situation that the world is in right now. And so McKinsey did a study, I think it was earlier in 2020, where they analyzed that $10 million invested in sort of fossil fuel utility scale technology was creating around 30 jobs. In renewables, it was around 75 jobs. And actually in distributed renewables, it was about 150 to 200 jobs per our calculations based on what some of the mini grid developers are doing. So there's no question that there is an ecosystem of SME entrepreneurship, agricultural development, small and mid-scale industry that is able to thrive as a result of having access to reliable electrification. I think for someone who's working on issues of poverty, the question does come back to that question of equitable distribution of community level infrastructure and how that's put to work. All of this means that to me, it's become a defining international development challenge today and for the next 2 decades, and it's going to be critical. It's worth remembering that this year, I keep saying this year, in 2020, COVID-19 is estimated to have pushed hundreds of millions of people deeper into poverty using an expanded $5 a day definition of the poverty line. So the modern energy minimum of 1,000 kilowatt hours, which, if you remember what the slide that Todd showed up earlier, historically that correlates with an average income of about $2,500 per year, or roughly $7 a day. So achieving a new modern energy minimum would really start to put people within reach at the sort of bottom edge of the global, what we think of as the global middle income or the global middle class. The last thing I'd say, and this is very much from an aspirational point of view, we think about the interaction between things that drive economic activity and inclusive economic activity and things that, if you like, challenge social constructs. We're really hopeful that a new wave of technologies that empower communities locally, that build new, that allow new types of solutions to be deployed is also an opportunity to address questions of economic empowerment of women. If you look at the electrification value chain or distributed technologies, these are sort of not socially constructed sectors in the way that perhaps some more traditional sectors are. So how do we use the optimistic opportunities that sit in front of us with some of the newer technologies to also address some very entrenched, deep challenges that also explain why the world continues to have such high levels of poverty. So we really are looking at this as part of a much broader canvas as we think about what the world needs in terms of economic development, social development, and equity at a time, frankly, that we faced probably one of the most significant disruptions in the last couple of decades.
Thanks, Ashvin. And thank you for bringing us back to the links to both COVID economic impacts and to women's empowerment. I hope we can touch on both of those in a little bit more detail as we go on. Todd, if we can, I'd like to jump more into the kind of nerdy details of the metric itself, now that we've talked about why it's important. One of the things that differentiates the modern energy minimum from other energy targets that people might be more familiar with is that it actually has two components. One is that a country's per capita consumption needs to be at least 300 kilowatt hours per person at home, with another 700 in the broader economy. Why did the authors feel that that was so critical, and what does it mean for different types of economies who might adopt this target?
Right. I'm glad you gave me a nerdy question. So, I would ask people, if you have a look at the paper, there's a nice annex. The entire paper's, the full report is only 15 pages, including annexes. We really wanted it to be very accessible. So I would encourage people to look at it if you have detailed questions. The 1,000 the energy ladder, because of the correlation with this midpoint of $2,500 a year. It's also, a nice big round number that is easier to communicate in global development. And then that 300-700 split that you mentioned, that basically uses the global average. Globally, electricity is about 70% used in industry, commerce, transportation, all the ways outside the home, and about 30%, a little bit less in the home. So we wanted to use that, but it's also, we wanted to have two conditions because we thought that was important because they're so intimately interlinked, and both elements are highly relevant. So if you aren't consuming 300 kilowatt hours at home, that means you don't have modern energy. You are living in energy poverty. And if you're working and living in an economy where the typical person isn't, on average, consuming 700 kilowatt hours in industry and commerce, then you also don't have modern energy. You're also living in energy poverty. And we thought that, using separate household and non-household consumption, two levels there, it more fully captures what it means to live in energy poverty in different contexts. So in countries like Egypt, Colombia, Thailand, Mexico, South Africa, these all have very high average consumption, but their modern energy minimum headcount will be below 100%. And that's because these countries still have work to do on energy equality and energy equity. At the same time, there's a lot of countries like Nigeria, Angola, Bangladesh, Ghana, Pakistan. These countries initially will have a headcount ratio for the modern energy minimum of 0. And that's because non-household electricity is well below 700 kilowatt hours per person. And these countries, while they have equity issues as well, they also need to prioritize growth of the power sector. And if I think I could just make one more point just about relevance. No one metric is going to be relevant for all countries, or is going to capture everything that we care about for development. Better development goals like employment and industrialization. And this means not only talking about the non-household consumption, it means that the metric just has to be relevant to a wider range of countries. And the current threshold that we're using is, it's critical for about 30 countries where basic access is very, very low. There's another maybe 24 countries where they're making progress, but they've still got a long way to go. But the access rate, the household access rate, is actually irrelevant for over 150 countries that have basically achieved that. But a lot of those countries, like Egypt, Ghana, Pakistan, they have very high access rates, but energy is still a massive constraint on economic growth, particularly reliability. And we know that consumption just has to be driven higher. And so we wanted the modern energy minimum to speak to those countries as well.
That's great. Thanks, Todd. I'm going to take one more kind of methodology-focused question before we open it up to the audience. So, Lauren, this one's for you. What makes for a good energy metric, and how does the MEM kind of stack up when you think about what you really need to see in something like this?
Thanks, Katie. It's a great question. I think, energy poverty metrics particularly are extremely difficult because there is no objective measure of energy poverty. It's unlike hunger, for example, where you can clearly say this is the minimum number of calories that's needed for human beings to survive. It's much more subjective to think about an energy poverty metric. And I think you see that reflected in the academic literature. There's a lot of creativity and a lot of struggle with coming up with lots of metrics, all very well-meaning, some appropriate in some contexts, and then others appropriate in other contexts. I think really across the board, what you look for is a metric that is both simple, comprehensive, and also accurate. And what I mean by simple, now it's probably pretty straightforward, but you need the simplicity so that it can be measured. It can be measured consistently. It can, the data can be collected. But you also need the simplicity so that it can be communicated, so people properly interpret what piece of data that they have when they're looking at a particular metric. It's important that metrics are comprehensive. So do you have the right scope? Are you aligned in terms of scope to what it is you're really trying to get after? And I think on this issue of simplicity and on scope, in the modern energy minimum does a really great job, especially in the way that it extends the measurement out into non-household, beyond household energy consumption. The third element I think that's really important for an energy metric is accuracy. And by that, I mean how well it approximates what you really want to understand, which is energy services. So there's a broad agreement that what matters in energy poverty is energy services. But because we can't measure energy services directly, we're forced to look at some indirect proxies. And so this metric, that the MEM, is a consumption metric. So it's a little bit indirect. And with all consumption metrics, there's a challenge in understanding how that relates to energy efficiency. So that's something that you need to keep in mind outside of the metric itself. And it's something that's it's a metric, consumption metrics, that is completely blind to access. This is a point that Todd brought up. If you're trying to measure access, just that initial household connection for services for light or communication, this metric isn't really going to reveal anything to you. A country could go overnight to 100% access, but you wouldn't necessarily see a reflection in the modern energy minimum because a lot of these households continue to be poor and to use a small amount of energy. And on balance, looking at these strengths and weaknesses, what I think it points to is the importance of having multiple metrics. And we already see that in SDG 7. We have the access target that just refers to basic household access. And then we have an energy efficiency target and a renewable energy target. And the reason we have those three separate metrics is because we value these three different things within the international development community. And so I think what we have to ask ourselves here is, how can we do the best by people living in energy poverty? Do we need to expand our definition to be able to capture this broader broader definition of how energy relates to the economy. And I know there's always some hesitancy to expand metrics, to have more metrics, but it really is something that we're quite comfortable with. And I'll just give a simple example, and that's in your own personal health, or if I saw your weight, I might be able to say something about your healthy, whether or not you're healthy. If I had your weight and your height, I might be able to say a little bit more, but I wouldn't be able to tell if you were sick. I would need a thermometer to be able to tell if you were sick. And so that's just a kind of simple analogy to say, as we think about energy poverty holistically, we do ourselves and people a disservice if we oversimplify what it is we need to be measuring.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. We're going to move to a couple questions from the audience. I think we have a first one coming in from Zimbabwe. So I hope we can get that up on the screen. Yep. So Shanta Bloman says, investments in clean energy are concentrated in a few markets with few players, with little investment in testing productive use solutions in rural and informal markets. How can we address this? And Ashvin, I thought maybe this makes sense for you to take first, given Rockefeller's work in rural markets, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. And I think you're right. Investments in clean energy are concentrated in too few markets. But if I link it to the second part of your question on productive use, there's an enormous amount we can do, and people are doing that. I think probably one of the most important things that we can do to address this is to create much stronger linkages between the agricultural sector and the energy sectors. I think we hear the phrase the ag-energy nexus a lot. Operationalizing that in reality is extremely rare and quite difficult. We do operate in a lot of silos. But I think some of the work that we are focused on right now is really trying to understand in a much, much more granular way what the sort of energy value chain is within the agricultural sector, so you can start to look at the kinds of productive use appliances and enterprises that can be supported alongside the activities to do with sort of improving supply reliability of electrification. There's a lot of innovation happening on sort of SME accelerators in this sector. There's a lot of work going into understanding on the metric side, going into understanding how to predict and model productive use demand that can then be tied in more effectively with interventions around productive use solutions. So, whether it's standalone appliances that are for productive purposes, or it's, larger systems that can connect to electrified appliances, I think there's an ecosystem that is emerging. We need, frankly, a lot more risk capital to come in, because some of these solutions are not yet really ready to go to scale. But I fully agree with the question, and I think that it's a critical area, because if we're talking about consumption, we have to stimulate demand. We're not just going to get to if you build it, they will come answer. It does come back a little bit to that chicken and egg question. What is it that drives demand? And what drives demand is expanding economic opportunity, access to those kinds of appliances, the ability to participate in supply chains and value chains. And so bringing these two sectors together, the sort of economic development / agricultural sector and the energy planning sector together, is what I think is something we need a lot more of. We're seeing some really interesting examples of that, for instance, that are still quite young, but hopeful. The ATA, the Agricultural Transformation Agency in Ethiopia, really now working hand in hand with the Ministry of Energy on electrification of agricultural clusters there. I think those kinds of, cross-sectoral innovations around this are what is going to be really needed to unlock that question in the medium term.
Great, thanks, Ashvin, and thank you, Shanta, for your question. Let's go next to a question from Anita in Nigeria, and she touches on a bunch of really important things here. She says, how can we empower young women to use green energy devices to boost agriculture with the view of enhancing food security to mitigate both COVID-19 pandemic and climate change? So there's a lot in that question. But Rose, I'm going to kick this to you, given your focus on women's empowerment at the Mwaza Institute.
Okay, thanks, Anita. This is a great question. I think one thing is we see absence of women in many kind of sectors, and especially in technology-related sectors, and energy being one of them. Obviously, since energy is tied to many other development sectors, like we've discussed, whether it's agriculture or resilience, whether it's from a pandemic or climate or growth, this means that, women are locked out of a lot of interesting work that's rewarding, and their talents and contributions are precluded from these important conversations. And so for me, I think the problem needs to be tackled a little bit more upstream of, often what we'll see is a lot of donors and actors have a lot of interest in seeing more women in X or Y topic, right? And so sometimes I'll be asked, okay, I want women in this specific, artificial intelligence, for example, how can we get more women? Please, can we have here some money? Let's run a program to get to support women in doing this very specific artificial intelligence thing. And obviously, there's a lot of kind of hidden talent at different points in the pipeline. But what I find to be more effective is, trying to think about ways in which we can strengthen the pipeline early on. And so before we can have women that are really engaged at this intersection of energy, entrepreneurship, agriculture, COVID, and all of the things you listed, we need women that are already engaged in some technical field, whether it's energy, or in one or agriculture, like one of these nexus fields. We need to have strong representation, and then these women are the ones who then start, can be sensitized and empowered to reach into these nexus areas. And so, I think for me, what is a helpful way to think about it is not just to look at the problem at the end of the pipeline and say we need women doing this very, very specific things, but how is their kind of development in all of the kind of the root sectors mentioned, whether it's health, whether it's energy, whether it's agriculture. Are there like interesting women who have support to follow their curiosity, to work in the field, to get industrial exposure, whatever it is, and then make these connections and work with peers, male or female, early career or older, to kind of push those frontiers. And so there are a lot of interesting programs I know that target women specifically. So, for example, like programs that support smallholder farmers, of which many are women. A lot of women work on smallholder agriculture. It's, I think, the largest employer of women. And there are programs in the agricultural sector that target those women in different ways and are effective and are starting to incorporate like climate considerations and adaptation considerations. I think, and those are great programs, and are doing good work, and they exist in all of these different subsectors and all of these different areas and geographies. More broadly, I think just supporting women to get full education, full opportunities, build confidence, have mentorship exposure, and tackle misrepresentation in specific fields, have women in more thought leadership and intellectual leadership positions. I think this will all contribute to the broader goal, and and kind of that's more of the work that I focus on, which is a complement to the more specific activities.
Great, thanks, Rose. We're going to take one more quick question from the audience. This comes from Darius Roberts in the United States. Is there any research you've done about the longitudinal impact of higher energy availability? Todd, can you touch on that one? Oh, we may have lost Todd. Ashvin.
Sure. I mean, I think.
Go ahead, Todd.
Am I back? You got me?
Yes.
I think I'd start by saying that, I'd point anybody interested anybody interested in the impact of energy on everything in our lives, I'd point them to one of our co-authors. Michael Weber has a beautiful new book out called Power Trip, and it's also a 6-part series on PBS that covers water, food, transport, wealth, cities, and war. So, for the big picture, you can't get any better than Michael Weber. For the background work for the Modern Energy Minimum study, we did look at the relationship between long-term income and electricity, not all energy, but electricity consumption. And I'll just say that there are no examples of high-income countries in human history that would fit in the World Bank's category of high-income countries that doesn't where per capita consumption isn't at least 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And the average among high-income countries today is more than 6,000, and in the United States, it's right now around 13,000. So in that context, trying to get everyone to about 1,000 it might seem like a big step up from 100, but it's really not that ambitious if we hope that all people are able to live up to.
Great, thanks, Todd. So those were fantastic audience questions, and I think we're about out of time. So I want to wrap up quickly, and I want to give just a quick sense of where we go from here. So this group is going to be pushing hard in the coming months to kind of make sure that this metric is out in the world, that people are reading about it, and kind of push all organizations and entities that are involved in fighting energy poverty to think bigger and to think about this as a new target for driving our collective efforts. So hopefully you'll be seeing a lot more of the Modern Energy Minimum. Before we close out, I want to sincerely thank Rockefeller for hosting us today. This was fantastic. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining, and also to the wonderful audience members who submitted questions. Please do check out the new Modern Energy Minimum report. We have a full version that's about 15 pages or so and a shorter summary. You can also watch the video that we played at the very beginning of the session, which is a great place to start if you're looking to learn more. There's the URL on the screen. And please also keep the conversation going online using the hashtag RFBreakthrough. We've really enjoyed engaging with you during this, and we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you so much.